Welcome to the May 2026 edition of Business and Policy News, brought to you by the Farm Advisory Service. This newsletter helps you to look ahead, prepare for industry developments, and stay up to date with the latest research findings and policy updates. Along with our regular monthly updates on policy, arable, beef, sheep, and milk, in this edition we will also be looking at the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme. Hello, my name is Brady Stevens. Along with this month's guest contributor, I will be presenting this publication. First up, we have this month's news. The U.S. war with Iran, ceasefire, but no resolution on the horizon. After a stall to the peace talks between the United States and Iran and Pakistan, and only a temporary ceasefire in place, there is no further progress on achieving a settlement in the Middle East. With no settlement on the horizon, the Strait of Hormuz remains closed and the pressure on global markets continues. The closure of the strait has had an immediate and obvious impact upon world market oil reserves as Iranian tankers are prevented from getting the oil to market. There are also massive knock-on consequences for other markets and products across the world, beyond just the petrochemical sector. The conflict in the Middle East and the consequential restriction to oil supply impacts directly upon fertilizer markets, with fertilizer prices experiencing a sizable increase during recent weeks. At the time of writing, ammonium nitrate is selling at around 530 pounds per ton, whilst urea is around 120 pounds per ton more expensive at 650 pounds per ton. As farmers face rising fertilizer prices and surging fuel costs, it looks like farm margins are going to be under pressure in 2026. With the prospect of diminishing margins this season, many producers in the arable sector might well consider an alternative cropping plan for later this year. This will have repercussions for grain and forage production further down the line, ultimately impacting upon food prices on the supermarket shelf. High fuel prices, rising fertilizer prices, and the prospect of higher food prices does not bode well for the UK economy, as disposable incomes reduce and economic growth plateaus. Nonetheless, at the latest Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee on the 30th of April, members voted unanimously in favor of maintaining the bank rate at 3.75%. The next meeting of the committee is on 18th of June, 2026. If the bank rate is to be maintained at its current level, much will depend on the duration of the US-Iran conflict and how the impacts are felt across the wider UK economy. In the financial markets, the FTSE is sitting at 10,361 as of the end of April. If nothing else, the ceasefire has stabilized the markets following a period of uncertainty and price volatility. Nonetheless, we are left with high fuel prices across the economy. World market oil prices are currently sitting around $110 per barrel. On UK forecourts, this translates to diesel selling at £1.89 per litre and petrol selling at £1.58 per litre. It's against this backdrop that the Scottish Parliament elections will take place on the 7th of May, 2026. Whichever political party comes out on top, they will have a lot to contend with on the home front, let alone dealing with the enduring effects of conflict on foreign shores. This edition of Business and Policy News contains our regular updates for the beef, sheep, dairy, and arable sectors, together with policy updates and articles of further interest. In our specialist article for the May edition, Harry Fisher takes a look at the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme and highlights some of the main changes to the scheme requirements for 2026. Note that there are two deadlines for the receipt of AECS applications. One deadline during June for agri-environment applications and a second deadline at the end of July for organic-only applications. Let's take a look at this month's policy briefs. Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme 2025 payments. The 2025 individual animal payment rates have been calculated and are as follows. Mainland, £127.20 per animal. Islands, £175.90 per animal. Processing of 2025 payments has begun, with payments having started to reach bank accounts from the 8th of April 2026. Groceries Code Adjudicator moves to Defra. The UK government's decision to move the Groceries Code Adjudicator from the Department for Business and Trade to the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or Defra, from July 2026 represents a significant step towards more joined-up oversight of supply chain fairness at a time of growing pressure on food systems. The change is welcomed as a way to better align supermarket regulation with wider agricultural policy and build on recommendations from the Farm Profitability Review. Aligning the Groceries Code Adjudicator with Defra is seen as an opportunity to strengthen coordination, share expertise, and create a more consistent end-to-end framework for fairness across the entire food supply chain. Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill. The Crofting and Scottish Land Court Bill introduces reforms aimed at supporting crofters by reducing bureaucracy and modernizing processes. Key measures include faster transfers of crofts within families, stronger powers for grazing committees, restrictions on separating crofts from grazing shares without consent, and greater influence for crofters over land use. The bill enhances the Crofting Commission's enforcement powers, proposes future regulation of owner-occupier transfers, and commits to a wider legislative review within 3 years. It also merges the Scottish Land Court and the Lands Tribunal for Scotland into a single body to simplify dispute resolution while preserving the court's distinct identity. Overall, the aim is to create a simpler and more coherent system for resolving land disputes as supported by stakeholder consultation and public engagement. The Cairngorms National Park Fire Management Bylaw 2025. The Cairngorms National Park Authority introduced a seasonal fire management bylaw, approved by Scottish ministers, banning fires and barbecues in the national park from the 1st of April to the 30th of September each year, mainly to reduce wildfire risk. The national park is home to precious landscapes, rare wildlife, more than 18,000 people, and a wildfire has the potential to be devastating. Breaking the bylaw could result in a fine of up to £500. There is a suite of resources and materials available on the Cairngorms website to help spread the word. Other public bodies could look to do the same if they have high visitor numbers in the summer, dry landscapes, and are at risk of wildfire incidents. Authorities would need a clear legal basis to introduce such measures, with formal approval from the Scottish Government being essential. In addition, they must also be able to demonstrate a genuine need for the legislation, such as heightened wildfire risk, environmental vulnerability, or sustained visitor pressure. A public consultation process would also be expected to ensure that local communities, stakeholders, and other users have the opportunity to provide input. For more information on any of the policies, updates, and articles in this month's edition, please see the show notes, where you will find numerous links to relevant websites, publications, consultations, and further sources of information. To conclude this month's policy briefs, we have 4 key dates to note. The 2026 single application form window closes at midnight on the 15th of May 2026. The deadline for supporting documentation to avoid payment reductions is also the 15th of May 2026. For the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme, the deadline for agri-environmental applications is the 22nd of June 2026. Also for EECS, the deadline for organic applications is the 31st of July 2026. Moving on to arable. Market overview. Nearly 8 weeks after the onset of the US-Iran war, markets are increasingly factoring into the possibility of a diplomatic resolution. This shift has eased some of the extreme risk premium, particularly in energy markets, with oil falling back towards $90 a barrel from highs near $120. However, this still leaves oil values more than 30% above late February levels, meaning the impact on fertilizer and fuel will continue to be felt at farm level for some time. As reported on last month, costing in current fertilizer and fuel values is adding a further £15 per ton to the cost of growing grain and 30 pounds per ton to the cost of growing a ton of oilseed rape. With geopolitics becoming slightly less dominant, attention is turning back to seasonal fundamentals: planting progress, crop conditions, and critically, weather. As we move through into May, these factors are likely to drive volatility, particularly given the already tight margins and sensitivity to input costs. With geopolitics becoming slightly less dominant, attention is turning back to seasonal fundamentals: planting progress, crop conditions, and critically, weather. As we move through into May, these factors are likely to drive volatility, particularly given the already tight margins and sensitivity to input costs. A key risk remains the Strait of Hormuz. While tensions wax and wane, any disruption would quickly reverse recent declines in oil prices and push fertilizer markets higher again. The geopolitical premium has reduced but not disappeared, and with negotiations between Iran and the US ongoing, uncertainty remains embedded in the market. Wheat markets have reflected this mix of geopolitical and production risks. UK May 2026 London Exchange feed wheat futures are currently around £177 per tonne, up from £165 per tonne in mid-February. November 2026 futures have similarly risen to £183 per tonne from £172 per tonne. Planting trends and input pressures. Elevated fertilizer and energy costs are already influencing cropping decisions globally. Farmers are actively reassessing rotations, with a shift away from input-heavy crops such as wheat and maize towards soya and sunflowers becoming more evident. The data supports this trend. In Argentina, only around 20% of wheat fertilizer requirements have been secured, raising clear risks for both area and yield. Brazil is expected to reduce wheat plantings by approximately 15%, while fertilizer delivery issues are being reported in Australia. These are not short-term changes. If confirmed, they could tighten global grain balances, particularly if input constraints persist for weeks rather than days, as suggested by ongoing risks to maritime trade routes. Weather is back in focus. Weather risks are once again coming back into play. In the U.S. plains, winter wheat conditions remain a major concern, with only 34% of the crop rated good to excellent, combined with the lowest planted area on record at 18.2 million hectares. Drought is particularly severe in key states. Texas wheat is rated at just 14% good or excellent, down from 26% last year, while Oklahoma stands at 13% versus 33% last year. Around 62% of the region is experiencing severe drought, with temperatures reaching as high as 32 degrees Celsius, placing further stress on crops. Elsewhere, excessive rainfall is slowing U.S. maize and soya planting and delaying Argentina's harvest. In Europe, conditions are more favorable overall, although the notably dry spring means that rainfall through May will be critical for yield potential. Turning our attention now to individual crops, first we look at wheat. Prices recently reached their highest levels since early August last year, before easing slightly as oil values retreated. The underlying constraints, however, remain clear: high energy costs and tightening supply concerns, particularly in the U.S. The U.S. wheat area, noted earlier, is the smallest since records began in 1919, and combined with poor crop conditions, this has been a key bullish driver. In contrast, the picture in Europe and the Black Sea region is far more positive. French wheat is rated at 84% good to excellent, while the UK stands at 82%, a significant improvement from 67% at the same time last year, and the best rating since 2023. Russia is reporting an exceptional 97% good condition rating, the highest since 2017, and their exports remain strong, with 4.5 million tons shipped in March, around 300,000 tons above earlier estimates. Production for 2026 is now forecast at 88.7 million tons, with yields improving to 4.04 tons per hectare, up from 3.93 tons per hectare last year. EU exports have reached 17.48 million tons so far this season, ahead of last year's 16.39 million tons, although a significant increase in pace will still be required to meet overall targets. Next, we look at feed and malting barley. The UK feed barley market remains supported by tight old crop availability. This relatively firm pricing reflects limited supply rather than strong demand. Markets are slightly higher week on week, largely driven by slow procurement from farm, with stocks now running tight. Following strength in wheat prices, barley is now trading at a much more attractive level relatively, which could support demand. Export markets are still tricky, and interest from buyers is difficult to come by at competitive levels. The malting barley market continues to show very limited activity. There are currently no meaningful bids from maltsters and minimal farmer selling, reflecting a broader lack of engagement. High stocks and reduced demand are central to this. Usage by brewers, maltsters, and distillers is down 18.7% year on year, leading to more barley being diverted into feed markets and putting pressure on premiums. Despite this, new crop plantings are looking positive, and spring sowing has progressed well under favorable conditions in all areas except the far north and Ayrshire, where wetter conditions have prevailed. Moving on to oilseed rape. Oilseed rape markets have tracked movements in crude oil closely. Following news of a ceasefire, prices eased, with delivered Erith values for May quoted at £460 per tonne, down £8.50 week on week, and November at £424.50 per tonne, down £10.50. For reference, Erith are based in London, and they specialize in the bottling of oils from seeds. However, as negotiations faltered, oil prices rebounded to above $100 per barrel, highlighting the ongoing volatility in this sector. UK crops are in excellent condition, with 84% rated good to excellent, the highest since AHDB records began in 2019. This reflects strong establishment and favorable spring weather, pointing toward good yield potential. On the demand side, EU rapeseed imports are down 33% year on year, while Ukraine has reduced its export forecast to 2.6 million tons due to the increased domestic crushing demand. Our last crop update covers oats. The oat market remains relatively subdued. Most millers are waiting for a renewed surge in retail demand before committing to further purchases, resulting in limited old crop and new crop activity. Unlike other grains, oats have not fully participated in the recent commodity rally. Buyers continue to focus on oat-specific supply and demand rather than broader wheat market movements. However, economics are becoming a concern. High fertilizer and fuel costs, combined with the relatively low oat prices, are expected to reduce planted area in key exporting regions such as the UK and Scandinavia. This increases reliance on achieving strong yields from a smaller crop. Our arable update continues with a word on trade. The UK trade flows reflect shifting dynamics. Wheat imports for the season to date, July to February, stand at 1.69 million tons, down 22% year on year, while maize imports are 24% lower at 1.52 million tons. In contrast, rapeseed imports have increased by 3% to 665,000 tons. Barley exports have reached 306,800 tons, but remain behind last year's 379,100 tons. Oat exports are a notable exception, with 73,400 tons shipped so far, already exceeding the full 2024-25 total of 64,000 tons, with 4 months still remaining in the season. Grain prices for April 2026 are as follows. Wheat, 173 pounds per ton. Feed barley, 150 pounds per ton. Beans, 215 pounds per ton. And milling oats, 136 pounds per ton. Let's take a look at the latest from the beef sector. Beef prices fall below 2025 levels. Finished beef prices continue to disappoint, with their downwards trajectory now tracking behind 2025 prices. While prices rose sharply in spring 2025, reaching £7.20 per kilo at the start of May, this year's prices are far less exciting, with finishers' margins being further squeezed. For the week ending 18th of April, Scottish finish price for R4L grade steers sat at 637 pence per kilo deadweight, 4.2 pence per kilo back from the previous week and down 6 pence per kilo from the start of April. GB deadweight prime cattle prices also slipped further back, with GB deadweight prices down 4 pence per kilo from the week previous to 630 pence per kilo deadweight in the week ending 18th of April. The GB average young bull price also fell back, however, at a lesser rate, down by 2 pence per kilo to 614 pence per kilo. While finished prices are not at the levels recorded in spring 2025, they remain ahead of the 550 pence per kilo received in January 2025. To put this into perspective, a 400 kilo carcass had risen by 680 pounds per head in just over 15 months, which has been followed by a drop of 360 pounds per head. Price fluctuations on this scale are simply not sustainable, especially when finisher margins are already under pressure from increased input costs, with further price volatility due to the US war with Iran. There is currently very little, if no margin, for finishers who bought high-priced store cattle in the autumn of last year. Consumer demand. Unfortunately, reports suggest that prices are unlikely to improve in the short term, with prices predicted to go lower in the coming weeks, a reflection of consumer buying habits. On paper, prices should be rising due to reduced cattle numbers. However, consumer demand is incredibly low. Consumers are reacting to increased costs, with fuel and council tax just some of the costs having gone up since April, which is affecting beef buying habits as consumers look for value. This is contributing to pressure on prices at the farm gate. With the summer festival of football ahead at the World Cup, kickoff times are expected to support the dining out market, and it is hoped that beef sales will increase. Continuing on the thread of consumer demand. Strong demand for cheaper cuts and manufacturing beef continues as consumers look for lower cost beef. Unsurprisingly, as consumers look for value when buying beef, mince is performing well and is a clear first choice for shoppers. Beef mince remains the most popular mince, with data from AHTB highlighting that over the past 52 weeks, 70% of GB households have purchased minced beef. Mince is a weekly staple for most households as a quick and easy-to-cook option associated with family meals such as lasagna and cottage pie. These family favorites are enjoyed by adults and children, thus reducing the risk of waste or the need to cook separate meals, which makes for an attractive option when food budgeting. Last year's price surge saw restaurants remove prime cuts and steak from their menus, choosing instead to increase offerings of traditional beef mince meals, which led to carcass imbalance issues while increasing the demand for manufacturing beef and supporting the cull cow trade. At the time of writing, the cow trade remains fairly strong, with prices sitting around 560 pence per kilo, albeit prices have fallen back from earlier in the month. At the May breeding sales, it is anticipated that breeding cattle will be met with strong demand. The annual spring bull sales at United Auctions Sterling and Harrison and Hetherington Carlisle will see in the region of 950 pedigree bulls go through the sales ring. Demand for bulls in recent years and values have risen significantly, with many breeds now averaging close to 10,000 pounds and some breeds above 10,000 pounds. Over the past 18 months, Suckler cows have at long last become profitable. However, the money now tied up in cattle is colossal, which makes buying in replacements a huge investment. To buy a heifer and a calf, it is likely to cost around 4,000 pounds. And for those looking for top quality continental types with shapely calves, it's more like 5,000 pounds. We finished the beef update with a word on the Scottish Suckler Beef Support Scheme. By now, most suckler producers should have received their calf payments for 2025. As predicted, there were fewer claims due in part to the continued decline of sucklers, but mostly due to the number of ineligible calves, meaning that the producers received higher rates per calf compared with last year. Mainland herds received 127 pounds 20 per animal, which is an increase of 15 pounds 88. Island herds received 175 pounds 90 per animal, which is an increase of 20 pounds 87. With fertilizer, fuel, haulage, net, and silage wrap all increasing recently due to the current situation in the Middle East, these payments will be welcome.
If you're enjoying listening to business and policy news, why not try one of the other Farm Advisory Service podcasts? In the latest episode of Rural Roundup, Mary Jane Laurie and George Chalmers cover numerous grants and schemes and discuss all things AECS ahead of the next round of applications to the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme. Tune in to this episode to find out more.
Moving on to sheep. Steady into spring. Strong demand in March drove deadweight prices up to a peak of 867 pence per kilo, stemming from a tight supply and boosted by both Ramadan and Easter falling close together. We have now seen prices ease slightly going into April. Prices remain well ahead of 2025 figures at over 800 pence per kilo deadweight. The live ring has largely followed a similar trend, peaking at the end of March at 408 pence per kilo before dropping back to 400 pence per kilo. Although we are seeing a steadying in live weight prices over the last couple of weeks to the end of the month at 405 pence per kilo live weight. This is positive, especially for early lamb producers, as more early born lambs will start to hit the market over the coming weeks, with the first couple of new season lambs hitting strong prices in and around 440 pence per kilo. Cull ewe prices have also remained strong, sitting just above 2025 figures at 143 pounds 6 pence for the week ending 18th of April 2026. Continued contraction of the GB sheep flock. AHDB have recently released figures from Defra's December 2025 livestock inventory, showing a 2.1% decrease in the national flock, with the flock standing at around 20.45 million head. However, data may be subject to change following validation of the Welsh flock. The largest contraction has been seen from the other sheep and lamb category, with the English flock down by 10.4%, and the English breeding flock also seeing a contraction of around 2%. This supports previous forecasts of a smaller 2025 lamb crop and demonstrates the impact from a dry spring and summer in 2025. With the reduction in breeding flock, alongside reports of lower scanning percentages in some areas, the 2026 lamb crop is expected to contract again slightly, with spring conditions also potentially impacting rearing rates in some areas. Fuel and fertilizer cost and availability are still impacted by global conflicts. Optimizing inputs and resources will be vital to maintain margins, especially with the silage season approaching. Reducing grassland inputs or a reduced number of silage cuts could impact winter feed resources and next year's outputs if not balanced carefully. Looking now at Great Britain on the global market. GB lamb prices remain strong in the global market. The price difference with France has tightened following a strong March. Spanish prices remain out in front, but do continue to show greater market volatility. Australian and New Zealand prices still very much reflect global markets, being two dominant global exporters. The Australian price continues to see a steady rise, again driven by a strong export demand and tightening supplies, with prices in New Zealand showing a slight decrease throughout 2026. Our sheep update concludes with a trip down under. Meat and Livestock Australia released their latest industry outlook figures on the last day of March 2026. Following prolonged drought conditions, especially in the key production regions in southern Australia, the potential rebuild of the flock may be somewhat delayed, with lamb slaughter forecast to also fall by around 11% in 2026. This may limit further growth in exports in the short term. Australian lamb carcass weights are expected to continue to increase, however. This is driven by genetic gain, lower stocking rates, increasing feed availability, incentive from processors for heavier slaughter weights, and the rise of intensive feedlots increasing grain-based finishing systems. Our final industry update looks at milk. Milk production data. Milk production continues to rise, with GB milk deliveries increasing by 0.6% when compared to the week ending 25 April. However, they are running slightly below the same week last year. The weather has improved at long last, with drier, warmer days allowing for cows to be turned out to grass and for many to look towards first cut silage. The latest data from AHDB estimates the GB milk volume for March 2026 at 1,132 million litres, 16 million litres more than the previous March. Daily production is currently 37.92 million litres for the week ending 18th of April, 0.6% more than the previous week and 1% above the same week last year. Turning to farm gate prices. The Defra farm gate milk price for March was 35.05 pence per litre, down 2.4% from the February price and 22% less than 12 months ago. At the time of writing, Mueller has served a number of businesses in Scotland and North Wales with 12 months' notice, with their last collection scheduled for 31st of March 2027. The agricultural director at Mueller explained that changes to the supply base were made to maintain a sustainable balance between supply and demand for dairy commodities. Graham's, Mueller, and First Milk have all announced a price hold for May 2026. The following Scottish milk prices are quoted in pence per litre. First Milk for May, 30.75. Mueller Direct for May, 34.5. Graham's for May, 34.5. Arla Farmers for April, 34.07. And Lactalis Fresh Milk Co. for April, 31.57. Moving on to dairy commodities and market indicators. The tentative recovery seen in the dairy markets last month has stalled under the pressure of continuing large milk volumes. The conflict in Iran has also undermined confidence and disrupted some export channels, eroding value in the fats markets. Skimmed milk powder has been the strongest performer relative to fats, with prices rising by £20 to £2,360 per tonne. Prices softened slightly in recent weeks, but found renewed support following a strong global dairy trade auction. Demand from Southeast Asia and the Middle East has been constrained by logistical challenges and elevated freight costs. Cheddar prices have eased after the gains made in March, with expected upswing in prices failing to materialize. The average price for mild cheddar stood at £2,980 per tonne, down 3% from the previous period. Demand is reported to be weak, as many buyers have already covered their positions, while sellers maintain reluctant to sell much below the £3,000 per tonne level. Bulk cream prices have lost much of the value gained during the March uplift, with the market appearing incredibly volatile. Ongoing conflict has fueled buyer uncertainty and dampened demand. Over the period, prices fell sharply from around £1.75 per kilo to £1.05 per kilo, bringing the monthly average to £1,238 per tonne. UK prices are reported to be firmer than those on the continent. As with the cream market, butter has experienced significant volatility and has given back all of the gains made during the first quarter of the year. The market is now averaging £3,540 per tonne, the lowest level since September 2021. Buyers are adopting a more cautious stance, while storage levels across Europe are reported to be high. A reduction was seen in the actual milk price equivalent indicator price for April, due to declines in butter and skimmed milk powder. This also led to a 0.47 pence per litre drop in the milk market value indicator, sitting at 34.91 pence per litre for April, which suggests the average market value of milk based on how it is typically processed in the UK. Blue tongue virus BTV control strategy update. Since blue tongue arrived in England in 2023, BTV3 has spread to all parts of the UK except Scotland. As temperatures rise and midge activity heightens, the government has implemented stricter livestock movement controls on blue tongue susceptible animals from restricted zones in an attempt to retain BTV-free status in Scotland for as long as possible. From the 1st of June to the 9th of September 2026, animals moving to Scotland must have their disease status confirmed by means of a PCR test, with negative results received prior to movement. Cattle fully vaccinated with Boltevo 3 are exempt from PCR testing. Animals from Scotland attending a show or sale in a restricted zone can return to Scotland without a test as long as they spend no longer than 4 days in the restricted zone. Slaughterhouses must be designated and movements direct to abattoir premises after leaving a restricted zone. We conclude the dairy update with a word on pre-cutting grass analysis. It is advisable to test grass around 1 week before the planned cutting date to measure free nitrates as well as sugar and dry matter levels. To reduce the risk of poor fermentation, nitrate levels should be below 1,000 milligrams per kilo on a fresh weight basis. Dry matter and sugar content will vary with weather conditions and time of day. Ideally, grass should be around 18% dry matter for cutting, and sugar should be more than 15% for dry matter or more than 3% for fresh. Under favorable conditions, grass dry matter can increase by approximately 1% per hour of wilting. However, care should be taken to avoid overwilting, as this can lead to nutrient losses. The target dry matter at ensiling is around 30% for clamp silage, with higher levels suitable for baled silage up to a maximum of 45% dry matter.
Hi, my name's Harry Fisher. I'm an agricultural ecologist with SAC Consulting, and my article focuses on the Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme, also known as AECS. So firstly, an overview. The Agri-Environmental Climate Scheme, or AECS, is a Scottish Government-funded grant that aims to provide funding for management and capital items that benefit Scotland's environment. The scheme has existed since 2015, and last year, Jim Fairley confirmed that it would be continuing until at least 2030. Each year, there are changes to the management and capital items that are funded, as well as changes to the application process itself. So keeping on top of these changes is important to ensure that a greater chance of success in your application, as well as ensuring that you know what you're signing up for the 5-year contract, the AECS fund. So let's have a look at historic application success. So the AECS application is competitive, and scores of your application are built up through a range of different factors. Examples of where points can be scored include things like the percentage of the farm included under management. So the higher the percentage of the farm, the more points you score. Benefit to protected sites or peatlands. So if you're managing a triple SI or looking to manage or restore peatlands, you will score extra points. Evidence of helping vulnerable priority species. So if you can demonstrate that species like curlew, snipe, lapwing are all present on your farm and you're putting management or capital items in place to benefit these, you'll score extra points. Benefit to watercourses or pollution, where you can demonstrate that management or capital items will reduce diffuse pollution into watercourses. Habitat creation can be used to link up habitats on the farm, you'll score additional points. Long-term benefits, so where capital items are put in place that will extend beyond the length of the contract, so things like water margins, these will score extra points. And value for money, so the more that you can do within your contract, the more points you'll score. Historically, the passing score for AECS has been around the 22-point mark. You can go into the show notes and have a look at the scoring criteria and see how many points are assigned to each of the criteria I mentioned above. But usually around 22 points is the passing mark for an application. The last 2 years have seen a change in that all of the applications fit for purpose were approved, but this was due to lower intake of the AECS scheme. 2026 is expected to be a more competitive year as we're getting to the end of the 5 years after the kind of end of COVID. So there was an increase in those years. So more people will be coming to the end of their contract this year. So there's expected to be more people applying. So the competitive score is likely to come back into play. The changes in management and capital options to look out for this year include the following. Many arable options, including beetle banks, stubbles followed by green manure in an arable rotation, forage brassica crops for farmland birds, unharvested conservation headlands for wildlife, retention of winter stubble for wildlife and water quality, and management of hedgerows have had their spatial targeting removed and are now available throughout Scotland. Stock fencing costs can no longer be associated with any wader, corncrake or corn bunting management options. However, temporary fencing can be applied for. Ancient wood pasture, now with this option, this covers existing wood pasture on an unimproved grassland as well as recently created wood pasture. For hedgerow creation, any new hedge must link existing farmland habitats on the farm. Small-scale tree and shrub planting option, the upper limit of 0.25 hectares has been removed, so you can now plant up to £4,950 worth of trees, which totals 1,650 trees total, in a variety of plots across your farm. The stock control, or what used to be called stock disposal, now called stock control for environmental management of designated sites. So what was stock disposal is now only available on sites that are designated. As well as this, if you have been in contract for this option for more than 15 years, be it through AECS or previous environmental funding schemes, you will not continue to have this funded on your farm. And slurry stores are not available within the 2026 application deadline. The deadline for the scheme for standalone agri-environment options is the 22nd of June. And the 31st of July is the deadline for organic-only applications. If you're applying for organic and agri-environment options, then the earlier deadline of the 22nd of June is your deadline. To hear more about the recent changes to AECS and what options to consider on your farm, I'd recommend listening to the FAS podcast Thrill of the Hill with Alec Perry and David Brown, called Where Policy Meets Pasture, the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme. This gives a good overview of the changes and what a successful application could look at.
Business and Policy News has links in the show notes to allow you to dig deeper into further articles of note. This month, we have 3 top picks. At number 1, it's Slatted Sheep Housing Made Simple. Housing sheep on slats can significantly reduce bedding costs and labor demands while improving hygiene within the housing environment. This practical guide provides the information you need to design an effective slatted system to boost productivity and profitability within your flock. Our second article looks at setting up a new grass lay for success. Last month, we highlighted Lorna Galloway's article, Agronomy for EFA Herb and Legume-Rich Swards. And this month, we follow on with another article from Lorna titled, Setting Up a New Grass Lay for Success. Management of a grass lay in its first year will dictate the persistence and yield potential of that sward in future years. This article covers the key considerations for successful establishment. Our third special feature pick is a Cropcast podcast focusing on PCN and water scarcity. Tune into this episode of Cropcast to find out what is PCN, how do we know if there is PCN in a field, potato variety choice, the impact of other crops on PCN, and hear about results from PCN Action Scotland. In the second part of the podcast, we hear about the new CREW water scarcity guidance, identifying water scarcity risks, easy wins for farmers, and key project outcomes. You can view the original version of the articles and listen to the podcast using the links provided in the show notes. And if you have any questions, please email advice@fas.scot. From all the business and policy team, thank you very much for listening to this audio edition of Business and Policy News. Remember to like Business and Policy News to get notified of future episodes of this monthly podcast. Our next edition is due out on the 10th of June. A written version of this newsletter is available on the FAS website. To receive a copy each month, search for FAS newsletters and subscribe to Business and Policy. This newsletter was edited by Alistair Beattie and included articles written by Alistair Beattie, Heather Stewart, Mark Boucher-Gibbs, Sarah Balfour, Lauren Shaw, Kira Sanahan, and Harry Fisher. This podcast is produced in association with Scottish Government and was presented by me, Brady Stevens, produced by Heather Stewart, edited by Robbie Campbell, with executive producers Kirsten Blackwood and Carrie Hammond.